So what exactly was Saul's qualification for kingship?
Honestly, it seems like it's just that he was tall. There is no obvious qualification. He hasn't proven himself in any way before he's chosen by Samuel. There are a few stories of how it is that a few perhaps differing accounts in there of how it was that he was chosen. In some case, Samuel sort of anoints him secretly, and there's a part where he's chosen by lots, and there's one where they're sort of looking for whoever it is, and he stands up, and it turns out, and everyone sort of sees, boy, that guy's really tall, and they all say, he's our king.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a very high bar, really, but in part that
In
has
a sense, it was a high bar.
in part that has to do with the fact that there wasn't a great variety of responsibility to being king at this point.
What do you want a king to do, in fact?
As far as I can tell, you want him to do exactly what a judge did. That is, you want a king to be able to defend you. Right? It's a purely military, purely defense-oriented kind of thing.
So first requirement is brute strength.
Probably.
Now, funnily enough, I think this will still hold true with a lot of texts that speak about a Messiah later on, that one of the ideals was somebody who can smash the heads of your enemies. Mm-hmm. And if you can't do that, now you may want him to do some other things, but if you can't do that, he's no good to you.
Yeah, it sort of is the first condition, right? And it is really the first thing the Israelites look for in a king is someone who can defend them.
Yeah.
Right? And again, when we talk about sort of the military position of kingship, it is always defensive, right? The Israelites are, for the most part, not going out and conquering anybody else, right? They are, as always, sort of just constantly under threat.
Yeah.
The ability to hold off the Philistines, primarily.
Yeah.
Becomes the defining role of the king. in these early stages.
Well, now, this was also the defining role of the judge.
Yeah.
So what makes the difference? When does a judge become a king? What does he have to have?
It seems like there are a couple of relatively small but important differences, at least when it comes to the shift from judges to Saul's kingship. The most important, I think, is permanence. Right? In other words, with the judges, it was, there's a threat, we need someone to counter that threat right now. And then when the next threat comes along, we'll need somebody else. And with Saul, with the king, it's a permanent position. We are simply saying, we want you to be the one who, whatever comes along, takes care of it from now until you die. And when you die, and this is the second equally important condition, I think, as with kingship everywhere, the position will be transferred down to your children.
To your children. And that I think is maybe the more crucial difference, because at least in the book of Judges, they will routinely say that so-and-so judged Israel for 40 years, even though that seems to be a formula that they tack on to the stories.
Yeah.
But now, of course, Saul will not manage to pass the kingship on to his son.
No, but there is clearly an expectation that he will. I mean, one of the things that happens in these sort of early chapters of Saul is we see Jonathan, his son, take up an important position in the military. And we will turn to one of these stories shortly. But Jonathan, as the crown prince, if you will, his job is also to be a strong military leader. And you see in these stories of Saul's battles that Jonathan is taking that position. In other words, priming himself to be king after Saul is gone.
And when David comes along, he has the problem that he is running against an incumbent.
Exactly.
And that would be an interesting thing to watch. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, how is Samuel taking all of this?
Well,
Get the impression at the beginning that he wasn't keen.
Right, he wasn't keen on as we talked about last time, he wasn't keen on the idea of kingship at all. Right, God sort of has to talk him down. Right, but Samuel's instinct is, as you'll remember, right, God says they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me, which implies that Samuel's instinct was that the people were rejecting him. Right, they say,
it's
right,
personal.
Right, that you've gotten old, Samuel. Right, we need somebody new. Nobody likes to be replaced, John. So. Samuel might have something of an ambivalent, if not outright hostile attitude toward the person who he's tasked with anointing as king, as ruler in his place, essentially.
See, I think this is what makes the books of Samuel good reading, is that it's very credible. Very credible human story.
Yeah.
Now, there's a layer of it that wants you to believe that, well, Samuel was just saying what God told him to say, and the reason he doesn't like Saul is that Saul wasn't obedient to the word of God. But there's also a layer of the story that you can see that Samuel doesn't like Saul because he's displacing him.
Yeah, it's
and
funny.
That he's pushing him over the hill.
It's funny, one of the things that happens, there are prophets and there are prophets. And when Moses spoke, we knew that he was repeating something that God had said. In many cases, because we read, God said to Moses this, and in fact, then all we see is, and Moses said it to the people, and we don't get it repeated. In this case, we have the exact reverse, right? We don't hear God saying to Samuel, strip the kingship from Saul. We just have Samuel saying, God said to me, you don't get the kingship anymore. And so, and that in many ways does sort of humanize it very much, makes it quite possible to read as Samuel really just not pleased with the notion of this guy whose qualification was height, taking over after Samuel had successfully sort of been ruling the place for a while.
Yeah. Now, we have 3 stories here in 1 Samuel of clashes between Saul and Samuel. And I think maybe it would be good to look at them. The first one is a battle. Jonathan and the defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines mustered to fight. And then when the Israelites saw that they were in distress, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. Another nice little touch. Some Hebrews crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead, and Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. And he waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, and Samuel did not come to Gilgal. So the people began to slip away from Saul. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering to me, and the offering of well-being. And he offered the burnt offering. And as soon as he had done that, Samuel shows up and says, what have you done? When they saw the people were slipping away from me, and that you didn't come within the days appointed, then I figured I'd better do something about it. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. If you had kept the commandment of the Lord your God, the Lord would have established your kingdom forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart.
A phrase that we will come back to later on.
A phrase that we will come back to. Now, is he being fair to Saul here?
It seems a relatively small crime to have offered sacrifices before Samuel showed up.
Not only that, but I think you could say there's entrapment.
Well, there certainly may well be, right? You do get the sense that Samuel was sort of hiding in the bushes waiting for Saul to do this before he jumped out and said, aha. I will say the way the story is told has real resonances to me of the golden calf story, right? As the missing leader and the sacrifices that are offered, and the one who offers them saying, what was I supposed to do? It was the people. I had to do something for the people. And so, if that echo is an authentic one, I think we can see that there is some blame being attached to Saul. But again, not a lot here. Not a lot. Samuel seems unduly upset, and certainly the stripping of the kingship on these grounds seems entirely out of proportion.
An overreaction.
Certainly so.
Yeah. But, here again, there seem to be 2 layers running through the story. That on the one hand, you have a very credible story of the tension between 2 leaders, between the old man on his way out and the young man who wants to rationalize things in ways. Actually, it's the practical question is it better to offer the sacrifice and keep the army, or obey this supposed divine command?
And in fact, that question of sort of practical leadership is what comes up also in the story in chapter 15.
Yeah.
Where, Saul is doing what seems to be a perfectly reasonable thing.
Yeah.
But Samuel has the opportunity to sort of, get him on a technicality.
And on the other hand, then there seems to be the Deuteronomistic layer where this shows that Saul didn't keep the word of the Lord and therefore equals a bad king.
So these are the stories that will come to justify David's kingship and the failure of Saul's. But at the same time, there's certainly an aspect of them that feels like Saul has been sort of treated quite unfairly.
Yes, and there's also an aspect that feels that it's a tension between the old charismatic kind of leadership where you're guided by the Spirit of the Lord and a more rational approach to things. And I think that comes out nicely in the next story, where in a battle Saul says, puts the people under an oath not to eat anything until they have routed the Philistines. Yeah. And Jonathan hasn't heard this, and he sees a bit of honey and he scoops it up, and then they go on and rout the Philistines. But then people point out that this oath has been broken.
Yeah.
And so they cast lots, and it's a nice passage describing the social structure of how they winnow out the different families, but it becomes apparent that it's Jonathan.
Right.
And Jonathan says, look, this was a stupid thing for my father to do. If we had eaten a good meal, we'd have done a whole lot better in the battle. And my eyes were brightened when I tasted the honey. Yeah. So the question then is, what do you do if you have made a vow to the Lord that, and Saul had said, and whoever does this, even if it's my son Jonathan.
A bit of foreshadowing.
Yes. Yeah. Now,
yeah, I mean, there are other, of course, stories of vows, right? The most famous is the story of Jephthah in the book of Judges, right, where he makes a stupid vow that ends up implicating the death of his daughter.
Yeah, where he vows that the first one to come out of the right,
the first thing that walks out of his house, he'll sacrifice.
Yeah. And it turns out to be his daughter.
Right.
Now, in that case,
he does it.
He does it. He feels bound by the vow. And not only that, but his daughter says, Daddy, if you swore this oath, do to me as you have vowed. Just give me a little time.
Yep.
But now, in Saul's case, the army says, hell no, he's the best man we've got.
Exactly.
And so he doesn't.
Yeah.
So in each of these stories, I think, you see Saul, in the end, doing the more pragmatic thing. But there is also the suggestion that he's being condemned for that.
Yeah, he is violating, in each of the three stories, and we'll get to the third one in a moment, he violates a law. He really does do something that, according to a strict reading of the law, would be wrong. Is it worthy of stripping a kingship away or of death? I'm not sure. But there's no question that he is doing something that he shouldn't do. The question is,
is it that big?
And he's conscious that to not do so, to violate the law, is probably the wiser course of action on a practical scale.
Now let's just have a quick word about the third story.
Yeah.
In this case, he holds back. Samuel tells him to slaughter all of the enemy.
Yeah, to do the classic Deuteronomic practice of what's called cherem, right? The ban, right? That is to go when you go in to capture a town, right? You are to slaughter all of its inhabitants, men, women, children, beasts, everything, right? You cannot take anything for yourself, right? The army can't take any captives or any loot, right? And he fails to do so, right? So Saul actually
holds back some, and he says it's so that he can offer them as a sacrifice to the Lord. And then you get this famous passage from Samuel: has the Lord has great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice, as in obedience to the voice of the Lord. Now, that is a refrain that you'll meet often in the prophets, where it has quite a different connotation, it seems to me. That in the prophets, it usually means that sacrifice isn't as important as your moral behavior.
Right.
Now, in this case, that sacrifice isn't as important as obeying me.
Right.
This is what Samuel is saying.
I think that's right.
So the upshot of the matter is that poor Saul is on the outs, and he's going to go downhill from there. But at this point, I think we'll turn to the rising star of the books of Samuel, and that is David.